I don't know if you guys noticed it, but we moved our speakers. We got them mounted, and it sounds good. It is wonderful. One of the challenges that we had was that we would be praying for people while the speakers were right here directly in our faces, and you'd be trying to listen to what the person was saying, and you didn't want to ask 14 times in a row, and so we're grateful for that. I'm incredibly grateful for the worship team who led us into God's presence. And the thing that I love so much that every time I have the opportunity to brag on any of our team I want to do is that what you are seeing is an overflow. You're seeing an overflow of what happens on Thursdays as they practice, what they do through the week in their own time, and what we do as a team before anyone shows up outside of the team. I'm really grateful. We're in this series called Formed and Transformed, but it's more than a series. It's a whole initiative of us thinking and rethinking how we are being formed and transformed. Spiritual formation, Robert Mulholland defines as being formed into the image of Christ or Jesus for the sake of others. This is what we want to do. We want to be formed and transformed into the image of Jesus for the sake of others. So if you saw our sign out in the lobby, it says we exist to make it all about people seeing Jesus. We want to create space to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus did. And today, this week, we begin a new journal. So if you have not grabbed one, make sure as you're leaving to grab one. Or if you have a terrible memory, you have full permission right now to get up out of your seats and go into the lobby and grab one. I want to remind us why we have these. We're not doing this just to make busy work or have more things that we're doing. What we are trying to do as a church is create structure for our personal growth and collective growth. What I want you to picture, even when you're in the lobby, you'll see a trellis with a vine. This creates structure, creates a trellis for growth to happen in the way of Jesus. And today I want to explore the spiritual practice of generosity. Generosity in the way of Jesus. N.T. Wright has this quote that I think is beautiful. He says this: "The kingdom that Jesus preached and lived was all about a glorious, uproarious, absurd generosity." The kingdom that Jesus preached and lived was all about a glorious, uproarious, absurd generosity. When's the last time you used the word uproarious? Well, we know what it means. We feel some of that, this uproarious, absurd generosity. This is what Jesus preached. Now, a couple of things before I dig in. I want to acknowledge a few things. First, I'm going to be speaking about Jesus' view of money. So if you're in the room and you would not call yourself a follower of the way of Jesus, I want to just be really clear. We are not putting his rule of life or his way of life on you as an expectation. That unless you follow Jesus, this is not something that we are trying to heap on top of what you are already doing. But for those of us who are followers of the way of Jesus, Jesus invites us to live differently, specifically in the area of money. In all areas of our life, he invites us to reorient our life according to his way. So that's the first thing. Second, I am very aware that money is a topic that many of us have very complex feelings about. Maybe you heard me say generosity and you're like, I should not have come this week. He's going to beat me over the head with something. I'm going to feel guilty, and that's certainly not my heart. But it's important that you understand that Jesus talked about money a lot. He talked about money in a way that was important for us to understand, because it's important for us to know, before I get anything, spoiler alert, that it's not really about our money, it is about our heart. That money reveals what is happening on the inside of us. And so Jesus understood the pull towards money to form our way of thinking and was active in helping his followers to pursue a different way. Matthew 6:21, Jesus says, "Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be." Our money both demonstrates and determines our priorities. Now, this can be immensely challenging. It can be really convicting, or it can be incredibly encouraging. The more that you live your life financially in the way of Jesus, the more that you experience something different, the more that you see what Jesus describes as life, and life to the full. As we apprentice under the way of Jesus, as we surrender to Jesus as Lord of our lives, it changes everything for us. We are undergoing a whole life transformation. And money is an area that many of us treat as off limits. However, when we follow Jesus, he becomes the Lord of our life in all areas, including our bank account and budget. Next week, we're going to spend some more time talking through the budget side of things and some of the more practical pieces. And it's important that I pause here for a moment just to communicate. We don't just want you to be generous. What we really want for our church is to be financially healthy. We believe that if, as a church, we can be financially healthy, that the impact on those around us is significant. So it's not just about tacking on a little generosity. It is about reorienting our finances in the way of Jesus. And it also means, as a church, that we want to help resource people to do that. So when you do your journal, you'll actually find some invitations to respond, because what we want to do is we want to pay for something that is a resource that allows each of us that are looking to get a hold of our finances better to do that well. We want to resource our people to do the things that we are asking them to do. And beyond just generosity, we want financial health. We want families to flourish, marriages to flourish. And we know that the number one area of conflict in marriages is money. And so how do we, as we apprentice under Jesus, whole life transformation, actually do that well? We believe that if all of us get our finances in order, that we will be able to advance the kingdom of God more effectively. So before we get into some of the nuts and bolts for next week, it's really important for us to begin this week by catching a vision for Jesus' view of our money. For some of us, this is a refresher. For some of us, it's new. For some of us, it'll challenge and confront us. The Gospel of Luke records some of Jesus' words on money and generosity. Luke 16, verse 10 to 15 says this: "If you are faithful in little things, you will be faithful in large ones. But if you are dishonest in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. And if you are untrustworthy about worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches, the true riches of heaven? And if you are not faithful with other people's things, why should you be trusted with things of your own? No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money." And before I finish it, these are Jesus' words, not Tyler's. These are words that Jesus is saying to me too, to all of us. And in response, the Pharisees, who dearly loved their money, heard all of this and scoffed at Jesus. And then he said to them, "You like to appear righteous in public, but God knows your hearts. What this world honors is detestable in the sight of God." This is like the mic drop moment. What the world honors is detestable in the sight of God. It's a reminder for us that how we spend our money reveals our heart. Jesus himself here is speaking to this principle of faithfulness that is essential for us to understand if we follow the way of Jesus. If we are faithful with small, then you will be faithful with more. But if you aren't faithful, God can't entrust you with more. Now, even this idea and what Jesus is speaking about here completely upends our understanding of how we view the money that we have, the resources that we have. It reminds us that we are not owners of the money that we have. We are instead stewards of the money that we have. A steward is someone who is responsible for handling someone else's resources. In our case, God's resources. Everything that we have, whether it's our possessions, our money, our time, or even our spiritual gifts, all of them are given to us by God for his purposes. And if you are generous when you have very little, chances are high that you'll be generous when you have a lot. And if you are not generous with a little, having more won't suddenly change your heart. Lee and I have had seasons where we have very, very little, and we've had seasons where we have more. And tithing, or giving 10% of everything, can feel like a lot, regardless. When you think about it, initially when Lee and I got married and she was new to faith and we were talking about it, and I was saying, okay, we need to give 10% back to the church. And she's like, do you know how much that is? I'm like, yeah, 10%. She's like, no, but the number? And can I just tell you, that number can feel significant whether you have a lot or a little. It's still 10%. It's proportionate. So there is a degree that you feel it no matter where you are. There have been moments that 10% felt like less, and other moments that it felt overwhelming as you're watching that go. And it's important for us to understand that the beauty of something like this is that it is proportionate, that it is not about individual amounts, but instead a percentage. The truth is that we are invited to steward what we have, knowing that God is actually watching how we spend our money. This is why Jesus says in Luke 16, verse 10, if you are faithful in little things, you will be faithful in large ones. But if you are dishonest in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. And if you are untrustworthy about worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches of heaven? And if you are not faithful with other people's things, why should you be trusted with things of your own? It's really important that you understand that this is something that for Lee and I, as we lead the church, we don't just believe for you, or even for us, we also believe for the church as a whole. I mean, it goes for us as lead pastors. We live with generosity at the center of what we do. We give generously. And when we give to collective, it is our first priority when we are paid, not our last priority. Even when it comes to the multiply offering, Lee shared earlier in the huddle with the team that Lee and I spent time and we asked God to give us a number, and we did it independently, and then we came together and surprise, surprise, God gave us the same number. And so we are, on November 17th, we are committing to give towards the multiply offering. We are sacrificing some things out of our budget and going above that to the multiply offering. Now, just so I'm really clear, I'm not telling you that to go, see, look at us. I'm telling you that to communicate we are not asking people to do something that we are not willing to do. That this has to be an overflow thing. Even in the context of the church, we have from the very beginning given at least 10% of everything to other organizations. Because we believe that if we are asking people to live generously, we better model it first. We want to be faithful. We want to be trustworthy with what God gives us. And we have found that every single year as a church, our budget has increased, and our giving has increased, and our margin has increased. And so for us, we believe in the principle of being faithful with less so that God can entrust us with more. We don't want to just talk about generosity, we want to model it. And I want to remind you that generosity matters because Jesus tells us how we spend our money reveals our heart. The next section where Luke captures Jesus' words is a sobering one. He says in verse 13, "No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money." It's important that you understand, and certainly I want you to understand from a pastoral perspective that money represents a battle for our hearts. Jesus places money as a significant barrier to living in the way of Jesus. Selwyn Hughes says this, "Remember this, you can't serve God and money, but you can serve God with money. Your money can serve God's purposes here on earth." What an incredible invitation for us to steward the resources that God gave us in the first place to accomplish what he wants to accomplish in our midst. Billy Graham has this really beautiful quote that I think is important for us as we're trying to reframe our vision for a biblical view or Jesus' view of generosity. He says, if a person gets his attitude toward money straight, it will help straighten out almost every other area in his life. Money reveals priorities. When our priorities are in place, our life begins to change. This is why for Lee and I, one of our spiritual practices around generosity is we give first. When we are paid, we give first. We want to practice generosity in a way that reminds us that this is God's money. He does not get my leftovers. He gets the very beginning. He gets the first fruit, if you will. It's important that we are living in a way that demonstrates our commitment to put our trust in God first and foremost. And I know that it can be easy to determine what we give by what is left over at the end of the month. And there are times that when I have lived like this, we have very little left over at the end of the month. I hope at some level that you can understand how that demonstrates what you are saying about your priorities. God gets my leftovers. And the invitation, I think, for all of us is, what if he didn't get our leftovers? What if God didn't get what was left over at the end? And it's important that you understand that even when we're talking about formation and being formed and transformed, that this idea of practicing sacrificial generosity, practicing intentional generosity is counterformative. It shapes us and changes us. It changes our desires. It changes how we see what we have. It changes our life. And I mentioned that 10% can feel like a lot. And I'll get into it more even next week, but if you look at the New Testament, you don't necessarily see this profound sense of you must give 10%. And so some people kind of take themselves off the hook, where they're like, oh, here's the bad news, is every single moment in the New Testament, people gave more than 10%. It was never less. It was like everything. So you go, oh, I can't really let myself off the hook. Instead, but what does it look like to even begin with 10%? What does it look like to begin with 1% and build toward that? What does it look to prioritize that in our lives? And the more that we do that, the more that we are shaped and formed in his image. And here's what I have learned to be true in my own life. If you see this as a practice of generosity, you'll understand that it does become slightly easier over time. That doesn't mean that you're not aware of the money, but it holds less of a grip on you. And so the more that you do it, the more that you're being formed in this way of generosity, where for Lee and I, we don't even necessarily think about that. And then it begins the process of going, do we need to increase our generosity? What does it look like for us to feel it again, to establish and create a rhythm of trust that is not just primarily about our comfort? The more that you treat money God's way, the more that you experience the freedom that he offers, and the more that you want to live generously. So every single time that we give, we loosen the grip that money can have on us. We take steps towards deeper surrender to Jesus. I shared this quote with our team earlier from Scott Rideout. He says this: generosity is not an idea, a hope, or desire. It is a choice. It is a direction. It is lifestyle. Our God is a generous God, and our goal as believers is to become like him. It's so interesting how inside of the church we can know all sorts of things and then just kind of compartmentalize it and not do it. So we go, yeah, generosity, totally. At some point I will do that. But generosity is not an idea, hope, or desire. It's a choice. It's a direction. It's a lifestyle. And it is overflow. Here, even when he's talking about it, our God is a generous God, and our goal as believers is to become like him. Again, we see the role of formation or transformation in the way of Jesus. And what we want to do as a community is move from the desire for generosity to the choice of generosity, choosing to allow Jesus to shape our view of money and create in us a more generous heart. I know that there are a range of people in the room from all sorts of different places that are in all very different places financially, even right now. And I do want to just be really upfront and communicate for Lee and I, our heart is for all of us, regardless of the stage that we are in, to be marked by Jesus' way of what N.T. Wright called glorious, uproarious, absurd generosity. So, in your journals this week and in your co-groups, you'll have the opportunity to wrestle with this more. I'm just setting the table. You'll have an opportunity to actually consider, where am I spending my money? Is it in line with where I want to spend my money? But before any of that, before you grab a journal, before you go to a co-group, I want to leave each of us with a challenge. What is God asking us to do? What is God asking me to do? And then the overflow question of that is, have you asked Him? For so many of us, we want God to speak to us, and we ask for God to speak, and then when He does, we go, no, not that, something different. Have we asked God what He wants us to do when it comes to our money? You'll have an opportunity later to give to God through Collective today. You could even set up recurring giving. Or on November 17th, there will be an opportunity to give towards the Multiply offering. But can I be really honest of what's under the surface of this that I so desperately want, more than just for you to feel like you are pressured into doing anything? I don't want that. You know what I want you to do? I want you to trust God with your money, and I want you to grow in your ability to listen to what He says and respond to it. I want you over time to continue to say, God, what are you asking me to do? And then when He whispers something, for you to step out in obedience. Can you imagine what would happen in a church if all of us were doing this in all areas of our life? And if Billy Graham is saying that if we get our finances straight, that it starts to play out in other areas, maybe this is where we should start. I want us to hear from God and invite Him to direct us and to say, here's what I want you to do. Because here's what I know to be true. The more that we do what God asks us to do, the more that He invites us into deeper levels of trust, surrender, and obedience. The more that I find that I do what God asks me to do, the more that I feel at times like I am stepping out into a very uncomfortable place. And yet, it has been so formative and transformative. I want that for us. I want you to take steps away from serving money, and I want to help you to move towards serving God with your money. And it's important that you understand, I want this for the rest of your life. As we are increasingly being formed and transformed in the way of Jesus, this is a lifelong pursuit of being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and doing what He did. I'm going to close with a C.S. Lewis quote, and I'll invite the worship team to come up while I read this. C.S. Lewis said this, "I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I am afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditures on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc., is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. If our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say they are too small. There ought to be things that we should like to do and cannot do because our charitable expenditure excludes them." I want to pray for us, so I'd invite you just to stand up and close your eyes. God, you are Lord over our lives. You are Lord over our finances. You are Lord over our budget. And God, I pray that you would remind us that it's all yours anyway. That you would give us a kingdom perspective of your resources. That you would help us to hear your voice as you are drawing us closer. that you would help us to respond to what you're asking us to do. And God, I think all the time about the idea of equal sacrifice, not equal amount. I know for some of us in the room, we feel like the widow who has 2 pennies that's giving. And God, you know our heart. You're not identifying us based on the amount. You are looking at our heart at the core of it. And so, whether we feel like the amount that you're asking to give us is small or not, God, help it to be in response to what you are already doing. God, we desperately need you to shape us and form us, to help us to become more and more like your Son. And God, I do pray that you would bless us in unexpected ways. God, we know that we don't just give to somehow get something from you, that's not your posture. But we do know that when we trust your money, that you do things in our life that we can't take credit for. And so, God, bless us so that we might be a blessing to others. Move in us so that we might be generous to others. God, I pray that your church, this church, would be known for its generosity, declaring your kingdom here in our midst. God, we love you. We need you. We trust you. God, have your way. In Jesus' name, amen.